This is the last in the series of short presentations that discuss some of the current myths in risk management. The primary purpose for managing risk is to improve decision making so that we make it much more likely that our subsequent actions contribute as much as possible to the achievement of our goals and objectives. It really has no other purpose. However, unfortunately, there are some in the risk management profession who seem determined to make these simple and useful concepts and processes much more complex and opaque. This set of presentations seeks to demonstrate how confused and confusing is the way many in the profession explain how we should manage risk. Myth 12 concerns monitoring and review, and particularly the monitoring and review of the sources of risk, the factors in the external internal environment that give rise to risk, and the monitoring and review of controls, particularly the key controls. While managers often see their role as assisting in the identification and analysis of risks, when it comes to controls, I'm afraid they are often only too happy to leave the assurance to internal auditors or other forms of third-party assurance providers. They wait until somebody comes around, maybe once a year, maybe once every 2 years, maybe once every 6 months, and tells them that the control is no longer effective, is no longer appropriate. Similarly, with changes in the external or internal environment. We're quite happy to leave those changes occurring and therefore rendering our previous risk assessment obsolete and inaccurate until we sit down for our periodic risk review. And sometimes this might be only once a year. A lot happens in that time, and it really means that we could be exposing our organisation to unacceptable levels of risk during that time because we've failed to detect the changes that are occurring externally and internally. So the myth here is the fact that these activities, monitor and review, can be left to somebody else to do. They're no longer the responsibility of management. Let's just examine what these two activities are. And I have to say often the two phrases are merged so that monitor and review is seen to be the same. Monitoring is supposed to be the same as review, when in fact they aren't. Monitoring is about routine surveillance of what's actually happening. It's about keeping one's finger on the pulse. It's measuring against performance, against required or expected performance. And it does involve continual checking, supervising, surveillance, and critically observing some function or activity that leads us to a view on whether the external or internal environment has changed significantly and whether the key controls that we're concerned with to enable us to achieve our objectives, that those remain effective. And therefore you see that monitoring is certainly the responsibility of management and often should be an integral part of management activity. If you do rely on specialists to go and measure something, then it is their obligation to report back to managers, and managers have the obligation to request those reports back so that they can drive any action required. This may involve a reassessment of the risk, a restatement of the risk treatment activities, and so on. So monitoring should be an integral part of management. It itself should not be left to specialists to do, to plan, and to act upon. A review is a less rigorous and a less frequent activity. It involves periodic investigation of the current situation, and often this is with some specific focus. We might review, for example, from a safety focus, or in terms of maintenance strategy, or in terms of the impact of changing of foreign exchange rates and so on. It is to determine the suitability, adequacy and effectiveness of the current controls compared with our existing objectives. And the frequency of the review has to be influenced by, of course, the level of risk. If the risk is very high, then we really need to review things more often to maintain that confidence that they haven't gone even higher. If the controls are critical in terms of ensuring that the organisation is not exposed to unacceptably high levels of risk, we would also expect reviews to be more frequent. And often these reviews are triggered by the need to report to a governance body, an oversight body, a management meeting, or so on. Particularly with those key controls, the controls that are vital to ensure the organisation achieves its objectives, these need monitoring. And we looked in a previous presentation, I think it was myth number 10, about how we might detect where the key controls sit in the organisation. We need early warning if those controls are not in place and not fully effective. We really can't wait for the auditors to pick them up once a year. We need to know within minutes, hours, maybe in days, but very early, so that we can take preemptive action before control failure leads to long-term damage to our objectives. This is the reason why we allocate the most important controls, these key controls, to owners. We make people clearly accountable for monitoring those controls, often as part of their day-to-day work. Infrequent periodic reviews, such as audits, really is not enough for these controls. And anyway, audits only sample. Their purpose ultimately is to check the checkers, not to carry out primary assurance activities. They only sample, and chances are they may not pick up the failure of a particular control. This three levels of assurance are summarised in this diagram here, which was published by Stans Australia and the Institute of Internal Auditors, and in fact the International Institute of Internal Auditors, in Handbook 158 in 2010. The title of the handbook is Delivering Assurance. And you'll see at the sharp end we have those third-party independent reviews, those audits. At the fat end of the triangle, we have the monitoring, which is regular day-by-day processing embedded into work activities. And in the middle, we have a line management activity, line management review, often called control self-assessment, or maybe these are periodic reviews of certain factors in the external internal environment that we need to conduct to ensure that our assessment of risk remains current, correct, and comprehensive. Thank you.